Hi, and welcome to Excel Sheets Made Easy. Today we're going to cover how you make your first pivot table. Pivot tables are not as hard as you think, so relax. After you walk through these simple steps, you'll know how to quickly create one on your own. So let's go. What is a pivot table? In its most basic form, a pivot table takes data and summarizes it so you can make sense of it, all without typing any formulas. So data would just be like a table with information. So in this one, we have a date, we have buyer, we have types, and we have amounts. Once you convert it into a pivot table, it summarizes the data. So you have who's the buyer and how much they've spent. That was just a simple example. Here's a more sophisticated one. This one shows the spending amounts broken down by type of purchase and by buyer. So this one you can see the buyers here, the totals that they've spent, and the categories that they've spent them in. There's also pivot charts, which are a more visual way to summarize and make sense of the data. We won't be covering these, but for now, just know they're possible to do. So the pivot table gives you a table with the data. A pivot chart gives you a visual summary of the data. But let's back up. The first step to making a good pivot table is to make sure that the data is in good shape. So make sure you do the following before you make a pivot table. You're going to want to name your columns with a header, and also make sure there's no duplicate rows or blank cells because that's going to mess up your pivot table. So next, something to keep in mind, lots of people use the word column, but to a pivot table, a column is a field. So try to remember this as you progress with the tutorial. So all of these would be fields, your date, your buyer, your type, and your amount. Let's focus on one of the fields. The amount field is probably the most important. Wouldn't it be great if this was summed up? So this is a pivot table. It's a very simple pivot table, but it's just giving you the sum of the amount, and then it's giving you the total of all of these categories together. Why make such a small pivot table? Because it emphasizes the concept of a pivot table value field. If one of the fields in your data contains numeric values, a pivot table can total it up. When it does this, it's called a pivot table value field. So this field contains numeric values, which is our amount column, and this pivot table made it into a value field, which is the sum of the amount. Pivot tables start getting interesting when you add conditions that divide or break down the value field. In this case, we added a new condition of buyer to divide the value field. So as you see here, now all the buyers are shown and the sum of the amounts. And here's another version of the pivot table, but this time we added the condition of type to see how much was spent for each type of purchase. So these are the categories of purchases that those buyers have made, and this is the amount that they spent for each category. Another pivot table term, the conditions we've added so far are called pivot table row fields. In these examples, the row field breaks down or divides the field values. Let's review. You'll learn how to actually make a pivot table in a few moments, but let's review the concepts we've taught you so far. First, you want to start with good data. We made sure that our table was nice and clean and that there was no duplicates or missing data. And then we added the row fields, which break down the value field, which is the sum. When you create a pivot table in a moment, you'll see the pivot table fields list. It's not just a list though, it's more like a panel. You'll see the pivot table fields from your data. So these match the headers from your table. So we have date, buyer, type, and amount. What you do to put them into the pivot table is you click them and you drag them down to where you want it to be in your table. After you drag the field to the values area, sum of amount will appear, which is what it's giving you. So the values can also be shown in like a count or an average, but this time we're just doing the sum. So because we want to have a more robust table, we're going to want to add a condition to the value. So this case will drag down buyer into the rows field. So that will give you the buyer and the sum of values. As you see here, now we have the buyers, Dad, Kelly, and Mom, and the sum of the amounts that they spent. The great part about this is that it doesn't require you to type any formulas, but it's still giving you the sum values that you would like to use, and it's very fast. So one thing with the formatting is sometimes you may need to adjust the columns width so that you can see all of the text and numbers in the pivot table. And this is just a common step when you're creating a pivot table because the data may not fit the size of the pivot table automatically. So on the next step, we're going to create a pivot table from scratch, and it's going to put it on a new sheet, which always inserts to the left of the sheet that you're on. So what we'll do now is create the next pivot table. So from here, we're going to select the data that we want to make the pivot table from. Then we select them, and then we go up here to our Insert menu and click Pivot Table. It has the range that we've selected, and we're going to put it in a new worksheet. You can also insert it into your same worksheet, but it can get a little tricky because it can take up a lot of space. So I'm going to put it on a new sheet and click OK. So as you see, our pivot table fields list is here. So what we're going to do is drag amount down to values, and then buyer as the condition. And as you see, we have now the buyers, dad, Kelly, and mom, and the amounts that they've spent. And one nice thing about pivot tables is if you adjust this data in the original data set, it will automatically update on your pivot table. You just have to hit refresh, but the data will be there. And that's it. You've successfully created your first pivot table. Congratulations.